talking about primarily, but also the things that are experienced on the job. I mean, that's a whole other training, right? And it's a huge issue, but it's kind of outside of the scope of this. But we do want to always acknowledge that it's there. Okay, so the activity. So facilitating the activity, and it's good to just kind of go through, you don't have to go through every single post-it that's up there, but just kind of skim through and, you know, maybe pick out a couple as you're facilitating it that stick out to you, or that correspond to different things that you might want to talk about later on in the training to point out to the group. It's kind of, you know, up to you in terms of the trainer, how you want to, things that you want to pick out of that. And then the learning check slide, it's just that quick review then, just to make sure that you kind of cover the key points that you want to cover, or if there's a particular kind of traumatic event that maybe wasn't mentioned by the group that you might want to mention for whatever reason. Then the officers talk about trauma video. So if you notice when you watch that video, that video is organized by the 3 E's. Did everybody notice that? So each of the officers talked about the event, what happened to them. They talked about how they experienced it, and then they talked about the effect or the effects that had on their lives, both personally and professionally. So that's something I always like to point out when, before I play the video, is that you're going to hear, you know, back to the 3 E's, you're going to hear the officers talk about each of those. Just again to kind of reinforce that message of the 3 E's. And then making sure that you give folks the brief instructions about what you want, orient them to the activity packet, and brief instructions about what you want them to pay attention to during the video, so that you can engage in a brief discussion with the group once the video is concluded. And then when you're done with the video, you've had that brief discussion, returning on slide 16 to the 3 E's. And you don't have to read the SAMHSA definition again, but just repeating the event, experience, and effect, and tying that back to the content that you saw in the video. So by the time you're done with slide 16, everybody should have the 3 E's down, hopefully. Slides 17 through 20 talk about or expand upon that experience and effect piece, okay? So slide 17, and again 17, 18, 19, and 20, you shouldn't spend much time on any one of these 4 slides. They're meant to be presented in pretty quick succession. But on slide 17, you just want to make sure that you are getting across the key point that traumatic events come in many shapes and forms. They can be single events, they can be ongoing, they can be past, present. You know, there's all different ways in which trauma can come about. But the key really is how a person experiences it. So going to slide 18 and talking about experiencing or how people experience it, a particular event. An experiencing an event is terrifying, threatening, overwhelming. You know, I may experience the same event as you and may not have that same reaction or that same experience. On slide 19, the emphasis is on the pervasiveness of that effect as well. So it permeates or is pervasive across many aspects of a person's life. Relationships, occupational, mental health, it has a pervasive effect. And then on slide 20, shapes people's worldview. So not only does it change oftentimes how people think about themselves, but it also changes how people think about others and about the world around them. So just kind of getting people in the audience to have that perspective that it's not just the event, but it's really how that event affects someone, and then how that sort of changes the way in which they see the world and their activities. And that's going to set us up for Module 3. So with this summary slide, again, you summarize. Those are pretty straightforward. Use that as an intro for Module 3. Any questions about Module 2 before we go to Module 3?
And you did the study on the trauma state. Do you have like a list of symptoms or checklist? Is that in the study that you cited?
Which one, the jail diversion study?
That you did when you asked folks about trauma, yeah, the one for males and females. Is that reference, they have that checklist or the traumas that were?
It's not in the binder. I mean,
But it's in the reference guide.
If you, yeah, the source, right? If you were to access that article, you could read.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm sure there's a chart. It's been a long time since I read that article, but I'm sure there's a chart that has the prevalence of different types of trauma in there. Any other questions about Module 2? Okay. So Module 3 is trauma's effects. Key learning objectives for Module 3. So Module 3 is, I'll say two things up front about Module 3. Number one with Module 3, this is the one where you can really, really, really spend a lot of time if you're not careful, okay? The goal of this module, that's our city for the day, right here in Delmar, our one fire truck for the day. With this module, letting the videos and the stories tell the story and make the key points is really important, and that's the intent of this module. That's why I think the video is, the whole activity is like 25 minutes, 20 or 25 minutes of the module, and the whole module is supposed to be 35 minutes, okay? Because we really don't want you to present, or give a very lengthy lecture on mental health and substance abuse and its correlation with trauma and all of the clinical kinds of things, or whatever it is that you might want to, or you may find yourself wanting to talk about there. Talk about a little bit of that. Bring a little bit of that in, but we don't want that to grow into, an hour and a half long module. So this is the one where you have to have the biggest amount of reins on yourself to make sure that you're not presenting too much of the material, and that you're really using those videos and the stories that are being told to demonstrate the key points. Because again, we could have a day-long and 2-day-long training on diagnoses and medication and biology and all that kind of stuff, right? But this is a 4-hour training, and that's just one piece of what we're talking about. So that's just a caution that I like to share with everybody before we start talking about Module 3. So with slide 23 in Module 3, this is where you can bring in, or should bring in, a discussion about the comorbidity of health issues, and where you can bring in some about biology, whether it's changes in brain structure. You can talk about some of the substance abuse sorts of things later when we talk about that. Here, I talk about a lot of different things in terms of different statistics. But this is where, if you're familiar with the ACE study, me personally, this is where I talk about the ACE study, and sort of orient people to that, although most people at this point are familiar with that. I'm talking some about the changes in brain structure and changes in brain chemistry that are associated with traumatic events. There's really a lot that you can talk about here. The point, again, is really not so much to give a comprehensive overview of all effects on health and biology that trauma has, but it's really to get people to think, oh, yeah, trauma has effects on health and biology, okay? Again, this is more of an awareness training than it is sort of getting people to really, know facts and things like that. So that's page, or slide 23. On the back of that page, there's a content note that you'll see there about the overlap between traumatic brain injury and PTSD in terms of symptoms. That's a content note that we developed because, again, this is a place where a lot of people, or often it would come up, this question about the overlap between traumatic brain injury and PTSD symptoms and the issue of TBI in general. So this is a content note and a diagram that we provided for you if you want to present that, if you know that that's something that's going to be important for you to talk about or going to be important to your audience. You can use that information to talk a little bit more about that there.
I found one for kids.
And then in slide 20,
trauma
24, slide 24 and 25, the behavior equals survival slide. This is where we kind of begin to draw things together and make the point that, you know, what we typically don't know what's going on inside somebody's head, but we do know what we see in terms of behavior. And as we've heard from people in the previous videos, as we'll hear from people in subsequent videos, behavior, or much of the behavior that is problematic for folks in terms of getting them involved with the justice system really represents their attempts to survive, or how they've learned to survive trauma and traumatic experiences. And going to slide 25, or sorry, slide 25 is really where then you can talk about and bring in some examples from the videos that you've already heard. And the way that that slide is set up is that those quotes there are from the videos. You know, so the first quote is from BJ, the second quote is from Thomas, and the third quote is from Stephanie. And you can bring in other quotes there as well, because there's certainly more than just that. But really, again, referring back to those videos, using that video content to help tell the story. Then on slide 26 is where we kind of start that whole section on the effects of trauma in terms of looking at mental health and mental health symptoms and how they can be exacerbated by trauma, brought on by trauma, can be similar to trauma symptoms, talking about relationships and risky behavior, and talking about substance use. So with this long-term effects slide, what we're trying again to draw the parallel or draw the association between are the things that are within a person or primarily within a person that we often can't see, like fear, feelings of powerlessness, anger certainly is something that all these folks talk about, pain, and how those internal sorts of feelings or reactions are correlated to all sorts of different negative long-term effects. So really focusing on the long-term effects of trauma and traumatic experiences. So that's what we want to emphasize with this slide as we segue into the three videos that we're going to watch. So the trauma effects video is, again, you want to orient people to what you want them to pay attention to in the activity packet. And again, you really want to get them thinking about, in this video in particular, about how, as they hear people tell their stories about their different symptoms and sort of the effect that those symptoms have on them, how might that be problematic in a justice situation? Okay, so again, really starting to draw those parallels, and then the learning check slide for that again is a really good place, and really where you can and should bring in quotes or harken participants back to the video that helps demonstrate some of what's on the learning check slide. Okay, and again, that doesn't have to be a long presentation, just briefly, but the learning check slide in particular for this video is a good place to do that. And I've just gone through in a lot of places, and quotes that stick out to me, I've just written in my binder with the name of the person who said it, so I can refer back to it if I need to, or if I forget who said something. And then slide 29 learning check slide is really a learning check on the overlap or interplay between trauma symptoms, and mental health issues and symptoms. Because as we know, people who have mental health issues are more likely to experience trauma or be victims of violence. So really kind of talking a little bit about that issue. Okay, and then the second video is the high-risk behaviors video. Okay, and so again, orient people to the activity packet, the questions or the things you want them to be thinking about real quick before you play the video. And again, when you get to watch the video, get the learning check slide, this is another good set of stories where you can draw a lot of parallels for why some of the behaviors that they described could be particularly problematic for law enforcement or for being involved in the justice system in general. And then with trauma's effects, the third video, the substance abuse video, again, same kind of setup in terms of the activity packet, ask people to think about, look for certain things. After each of these videos, just a very brief discussion about each of the questions, or the questions or the information we're asking people to pay attention to. And then the substance abuse slide, your learning check slide, is where if you want to, bring in a little bit more of a discussion about how substance use in particular is helpful to the folks who are using the substances, how substances can help a person cope, what are some of the biological or physiological effects that certain substances might have on a person that can help them deal with some of the experiences or the effects of trauma that have been talked about. So that's a good place to bring in a little bit of that as well. And then on slide 34, returning to the long-term effect summary slide, again, to just bring people full circle and emphasize the key points that you made when you first presented the slide as a way to wrap up and conclude the module. And then the summary slide is the summary slide, so that's pretty straightforward. Any questions about module 3?
Can you explain the rationale for separating out mental health issues and trauma? Like trauma is a mental health issue?
Well, it's not really separating out the mental health issues and trauma. It's more talking about, it's almost kind of like which came first. Most of the people, well, all the people in those videos have mental health issues, have mental health diagnoses, but also have significant trauma histories. So it's just that notion of a lot of trauma's effects can also be effects of having mental health issues, and not to be so caught up, I guess for lack of a better word, in what's a mental health issue versus what's a, it's more kind of talking about the interplay between trauma and mental health issues.